Good morning, good morning. Thank you so much for joining me. This is the podcast, The Endurance of Labor Laws. I am your lovely host, Lesley Sullivan, and today is episode 85, and we are going to kind of do a 2-for-1 special. We're going to take a look at two different things. We're going to take a look at the Rivers and Harbors Act of 1899 as well as the Refuge Act. The Refuge Act is actually part of the Rivers and Harbors Act of 1899. So I thought, well, it's probably a good thing to go over both of those because they go hand in hand and they're really quite interesting. But first of all, let me give a big shout out to my listeners because you guys are awesome as usual. I love to see you guys here. So a big shout out to Alabama, Manitoba, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Oregon, Florida, New York, Oklahoma, Texas, my lovely neighbor, and Virginia. In terms of countries, the United States, the United Kingdom, and Canada. Good to see you guys. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started on this puppy here. So the first one we are going to discuss is the Rivers and Harbors Act of 1899. So this goes back quite a few, many years, right? So this is what I was referring to when I said that, yes, we are dealing with different matters in terms of the environment and labor laws and things like that. But at one point, all of this was new. So our ancestors and the people that were born way before us, they were not morons or idiots. They knew what they were doing, and they wanted to help in any way they could in their country, which in this case is in the United States. So just FYI, just because something does not measure up to what we do today, that doesn't mean that it did not measure up at the time it was passed, or at the time that people noticed that there was a problem. So basically everything that we're doing is in baby steps, right? Because you have to get the ball rolling first before you can really move forward in a larger degree. You know what I mean? Like it's one of those things like it's better to take baby steps and things as opposed to biting off more than you can chew. So this is kind of one of those things where they're taking baby steps and they are acknowledging an issue and a problem. And they're trying to make things better because they know, just from what I've read with the Rivers and Harbors Act of 1899, they were very much aware that technology changes and can change rapidly. So that's why, that's one of the reasons why they passed this act, because it was very important to them way back in the day, and it is still important to us today. So this is really good. So it says here the Rivers and Harbors Appropriation Act of 1899 is the oldest federal environmental law in the United States. So right there we see that, people cared about the environment long before they ever called themselves environmentalists, liberals, or even Democrats, or conservationists, or whatever word you want to use. People have always been concerned about the environment. It's not just a party issue. It's a personal issue, and it's also a citizen issue. It's just like an everyday life issue. People get concerned about things, right? So, even though they didn't have labels back then like we have now, which I personally believe that having all these different labels is a mistake, because I think it causes separation and division, not unity. And it for sure does not bring about peace, the more labels you have. But anyway, so it says that it's the oldest federal environmental law in the United States. The act makes it a misdemeanor to discharge refuge matter of any kind into the navigable waters or tributaries thereof of the United States without a permit. That's what I was referring to in a previous podcast when I said that different permits allow you to do different things. So one of the podcasts, I remember not too long ago, we were discussing some of the lawsuits that have been taking place in regards to the EPA, the Clean Air Act, and all this different stuff, and one of them was about permits. Sometimes the EPA goes a little ape on requiring people to have a permit in an industry where the EPA doesn't have a clue what the industry actually does. And it doesn't understand how the industry actually works within the environment and how the environment actually helps the industry. Sometimes the EPA is quick to shame and blame. But here, this is talking about, not dumping basically garbage or any kind of contaminant into any kind of water, especially if it is a water where people navigate in, whether it's, ships, boats, fishing, swimming, whatever the case may be, but particularly in regards to waters that are used as almost like a water highway. Because what you need to remember is back in 1899, you have to think about the technology of like the horse and buggy, steamships, those kind of things, and what was the type of technology back then in terms of transportation. So that's why they were getting concerned with people dumping stuff in waters and also polluting the water. That was a big issue there. So then it goes on to say this specific provision is known as the Refuge Act, which is why we're going to discuss that here a little bit later. The act also makes it a misdemeanor to excavate, fill, or alter the course, condition, or capacity of any port, harbor, channel, or other areas within the reach of the act without a permit. So basically, if you're going to do any of those things, you need to have a permit and you need to know what you're doing. Like, you can't just randomly change the course of a river, just because you don't want it to go near your land or you do want it to be near your property. You have to be careful of what you're doing, because what you alter is sometimes what you make impossible for it to go back to the way it originally was. And it can affect a lot of things. And one of the things that this reminds me of, and I saw this on National Geographic, and I'm not a fan of National Geographic anymore because it's gotten kind of liberal, but this was actually really good and really important. I did not know that this was taking place. So, Singapore, as you know, is a very wealthy peoples, and what they've been doing is they've been buying sand or soil, but specifically sand, from different villages on the continent of Africa. And so they've been dredging these rivers and streams, and it's been destroying the ecology of those areas, and it's been destroying the fishing industry and the village life of peoples over there where they are getting the soil and sand. Because what Singapore is trying to do is they're trying to make it seem like they're bigger than they really are when they are not. So they're basically forcing themselves to become more of a continent. And that's not right. It's basically a lie. But here's the thing, whoever they're doing business with are these very corrupt government officials in Africa. I mean, they would probably sell their own mother or child for money. That's what I was talking about in a previous podcast when I said that, yes, the United States has its issues, but it's nothing compared to the corruption of other countries. And Africa has a lot of countries, a lot of city-states, and a lot of villages that are very corrupt, and unfortunately, it affects their people immediately. And what's really sad, and I can't remember the name of this National Geographic episode, but these villagers, they're having to go without food sometimes because this dredging, they bring in these barges, Singapore does, and, they're paying for this sand. They're paying for it, but they know very well that they are ruining these people's lives. And they're ruining the fishery business. And, these people, they don't really have a living of much anymore. So it makes it very difficult to provide for their families. But see, here's the thing. When you're a villager, you really don't know your rights. You know when something's wrong and something's affecting your life. But, one of the good things about the United States is that we have laws, but we're not overregulated like other countries, like socialist countries and whatnot. But here's the thing. Over in Africa, they don't have rules, laws, and regulations like we do. Like, they don't have permits like we do, because if they did, they would never allow this to happen to their people over there. They would never sell out, the riverbanks of their rivers and just let their people starve to death in their villages. It just doesn't make any sense. And also, you have to really call Singapore out on this, because Singapore is very wealthy. I'm not against money. I think money's great. But, the more you have, the more responsibility you have to do what's right. And you can't tell me they don't know that what they're doing is wrong. Like you can't just go buy sand from somewhere, ruin someone else's country or their village and not be aware of it. I mean, it's not the same as purchasing sand from like Lowe's or Home Depot. It's just not. And they literally have footage of these barges going into these village areas and up their rivers and streams, and right in front of these villagers, they are removing the sand that provides them, I guess, a natural habitat for all the fisheries that are there, maybe like crabs and fish and all these, different type of marine life. Well, this dredging of this area and these villages is ruining the biology and the ecology and just the natural environment of these areas. So then these villagers, they have less and less access to food. So that is a really big problem. So that's why these permits are important. Like the United States recognized this way back in 1899, but yet, Africa and its countries and city-states over there, they haven't really read the writing on the wall that you need to be careful about how you alter, change, or excavate anything to do with your port, harbors, your channels, your canals, any kind of riverbank. You need to be very careful with that, because whatever you destroy, it makes it very difficult to repair it. So this is why it's important that people have a permit and they know what they're doing and that they have permission to have that permit. And it's one of those things that you can't just buy or pay somebody off. You can't do that in the United States. In other countries, you can buy and sell permits like nobody's business. I mean, there's like no repercussions. You can easily pay off a government official over in Africa. That happens all the time. And it also happens in Jamaica, because I dated a guy that is from Jamaica. And, his family was considered one of the wealthy people in Jamaica. And so it was very interesting, because if ever the government officials ever try to come after his family, they knew that they could just pay somebody off, even though they didn't like doing that. And they knew that they were being targeted for money. That was just how it was in Jamaica. That's very common. That's like, it's like as common as weeds or grass. That's just how it is. It's just common behavior. It's not considered immoral or illegal. It's just how they do business. So that's one of the things that is really good about the United States, is that we don't behave that way. And if someone does, they typically go to federal prison and for a long time, if not pay millions of dollars in fines and fees. So just FYI, that's what I was referring to when I was talking about, these permits. Now I understand what's going on. There's a time and place for them. The thing I don't like about permits in the United States is when the government goes too far with them and makes it so difficult to get one, to acquire one, or to even utilize one. And then if they have to get one, it's not relevant to their job and it's not relative to their market or to their industry. It's just over-regulation of the government, or from the government is what it is. But anyway, moving on. It says this act also made it illegal to dam navigable streams without a license or permit from Congress. This provision was included for the purpose of hydroelectric generation at a time when the electric utility industry was expanding rapidly. So here's the thing. It's like I said before, where, the people that, came before us, they were not morons or idiots. They were not ignorant by any means. They knew that times were changing, but they knew they still need to preserve nature. They need to be careful about what they're doing, because they want to make sure that there is a way to preserve the environment so they actually had something to pass down to future generations. And this is all going on way before the EPA came around. This is going on way before there are conservationists and a bunch of tree huggers. And I love trees. I think they're wonderful. They're great. I very much endorse trees. They're very good and very important to our country and our planet. But here's the thing. A lot of these things that were done to protect the environment were done way before the crazy 1960s, when environmentalism kind of went off the rails. It just got really hyped up, and then you have like National Earth Day and all this stuff, and those things, they can mean well, but a lot of those things tend to be founded or grounded in socialism or fascism in a way. Meaning, like, we're just supposed to be one big giant community and nobody should really own anything. That's not the American way, and that's not a smart way to live, because everybody owns something. Even in communes, people own something. To say that, that nobody really owns anything and everything belongs to each other, that's a load of bull. That's horse manure. I could totally use another word to describe it, but again, I'm trying to work on my language, but it's just one of those things. Don't live a lie. See, here's the thing. If we don't take ownership of things, then how can we really know what's ours? That's the problem with communism, fascism, and socialism. They want you to think that, oh, everything's free, everything's for everybody. Okay, not everything is free. Everything has a price. Even freedom has a price. And it's usually someone's life. And it's usually someone that is defending your life and my life when we're not even over there fighting. Like, even freedom is not free. So we need to be realistic and knowledgeable about this and practice, that due diligence of being aware of things and not live a lie. Because here's the thing. Is love a wonderful thing? Yes. Is freedom a wonderful thing? Yes. But here's the thing. If you go along the lines of communism, fascism, or socialism, you lose your freedom and there's not much love anymore. So I think that's a lot to think about, but it's very important because I'm saying you don't have to be a nut to care about the environment. You don't have to be extreme to care about other people. You don't have to shame and blame Wall Street or shame and blame the rich to make a point or to care about your country or to care about your community. If anything, you shouldn't shame and blame people that can actually help you and that want to help you. Most rich people don't live in castles. So why are you trying to storm them? Why are you trying to tear down their lifestyle and their way of life? The rich have to go to Walmart too. I mean, the rich have to buy toilet paper, paper towels, laundry soap. They have to buy food just like the rest of us. I mean, really think about this. There really should not be a separation and division in terms of how we look at things, because here's the thing. What I've noticed is that whenever people blame the rich, they're actually just jealous of what they have. And jealousy is never appropriate. It is always wrong, and it's always jaded. See, that's one of the biggest problems with socialism, fascism, and communism is that it demonizes what it wants to steal so that it can give them permission to make the illegal legal to steal and to confiscate other people's property, possessions, their assets, their bank accounts, things like that. If you wouldn't like that happening to you, why would you want that to happen to anybody else, especially someone that is more successful than you? Whenever I meet someone that's more successful than me, I'm not jealous of them. I ask them, how did you get where you are today? What advice can you give me? I want to know, how did they get rich? And you know what? Every single person I've met that I've had a really good discussion with that's rich, they put in way more hours at the office than the average person. See, because here's the thing, a lot of their work, it doesn't stop once they leave the office. When they go home, they're still working. They're still thinking about their business. They're still thinking about the industry. So just FYI, it's very difficult to do good in this world if you're constantly looking at what I don't have, as opposed to what do I want and what can I have. Look at the positive. Because it's very much relevant here, because if our ancestors that passed this act and wrote these laws were just in it just to shame and blame, just imagine how tyrannical our government would be today if our government back in 1899 acted like how it's acting like it is right now. See, this act was written in terms of safety. It didn't go after Wall Street. It didn't go after big businesses. It just clearly stated, in order to do X, Y, Z, you have to have a permit. Because it's a safety issue. Safety issues apply to everybody. It doesn't matter what social status you are or what race you are. Safety applies to everybody. That's why this act is so important, and it was written in such a way that it protects the individual. Not an ideology. It protects the individual. Unfortunately, our rules, laws, and regulations that are getting passed right now or trying to get passed right now, and unfortunately some of them are getting passed right now, is that it's protecting an ideology. It's not protecting individuals. See, ideologies change like a feather in the wind. They go up and they go down. When you protect the individual, the sincerity and the common good of protecting that individual doesn't go up and go down. It's not fickle. It endures. It has resilience. As opposed to ideologies where if all you're promoting is an ideology, you have totally missed the mark of protecting mankind. Like, focus on what's real, not what is fickle, I guess is what I'm trying to say. Which is why I like this Rivers and Harbors Act of 1899 so much, is because it's not political, it's not based on an agenda, it's simply based on safety. Something that applies to everybody, regardless of your income, your race, your gender, your sex, your religion, doesn't matter. Even back then, they understood what it means to protect somebody. And what it means to protect the United States from people not really knowing what they're doing in regards to the environment. They just want to make sure that everything's on the up and up. So focus on the things that are tangible and not on political. Life will be so much easier, and life was way easier back then. It was way simpler and way easier because they just focused on the tangible and the things that are simple, the things that are good, and the things that are true. Was our nation perfect back then? No, and we're still not perfect today. I'm not saying that at all. I'm just saying that, when all you focus on is a political agenda and an ideology, you're always going to be disappointed. Always. And you will always have strife. Do not invite strife into your life. It's not worth it. Never has been, never will be. It goes on to say, although many activities covered by the Act are regulated under the Clean Water Act, the 1899 Act retains an independent vitality. The Act is administered by the United States Army Corps of Engineers. And then it says, let me skip down because there's a sentence here that doesn't make any sense. So it says, the Jacksonville District of the Army Corps of Engineers has jurisdiction over the waters of the Caribbean Sea, the Gulf of Mexico, and the Atlantic Ocean. So that's the short and sweet version of the Rivers and Harbors Act of 1899. Now let's go to the Refuge Act. Okay, so the official long title of the Refuge Act is an act making appropriations for the construction, repair, and preservation of certain public works on rivers and harbors and for other purposes. Let's see here. It was enacted by the 55th United States Congress. It became effective March 3rd, 1899, so it goes back a long ways. It says here the Refuge Act is a United States federal statute governing use of waterways. The Act, a section of the Rivers and Harbors Act of 1899, prohibited dumping of refuge into navigable waters except by permit. So basically, you better have permission or you're getting a fine and or arrested. Let's see. The Army Corps of Engineers administered the Act and initially focused on controlling debris that obstructed navigation. So basically, a safety issue. Keep it simple. Then it talks about pollution. Up until the 1960s or in the 1960s, it says, in the 1960s, due to increasing public and governmental concern about water pollution, the federal government began to use the act to control pollution. The government pursued court cases to prosecute dischargers of industrial waste to waterways. Notable cases include United States versus Republic Steel Corporation, from 1960, and the United States versus Standard Oil Company, and that happened in 1966. The next part is about the 1970 Discharge Permit Program. It says Congress had enacted the Federal Water Pollution Control Act, also known as FWPCA, in 1948 to address water pollution problems. But this law gave the government limited enforcement authority. The Department of Interior, which administered the FWPCA prior to 1972, developed a policy with the Department of Justice and the Army Corps of Engineers to use the Refuge Act as an enforcement tool to complement the FWPCA. In 1970, President Richard Nixon issued an executive order creating a new permit program under the Refuge Act. The focus of the new permit program was on industrial pollution. And we're going to go over the different types of pollution here very soon, because there's different types of pollution and different types of waste. And being that we've got all these different types, they have to be disposed of and handled in different ways. So it goes on to say the Corps of Engineers began to issue the new discharge permits, but in 1971, a legal challenge halted the program. So then it goes on to 1972, the FWPCA amendments. It says Congress enacted major amendments to the FWPCA in 1972. This in the legislation was a new discharge permit program called the National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System, which replaced the Refuge Act permit program. The amendments led responsibility for implementation of MPDES to the newly formed Environmental Protection Agency. Okay, so here's the thing. If you'll notice that previously it mentioned these two different government agencies, they're noticing a problem with the environment and pollution. So you've got these different agencies within the federal government that they are trying to address these issues, but it's not really going well. I mean, they're doing a good job, but it's not where it needs to be. So that's when President Nixon created the Environmental Protection Agency, and he brought all these federal agencies that deal with the environment under one umbrella so that they would actually talk to each other and speak to each other, because it's very hard to implement and it's very hard to enforce something when you don't know what the right hand is doing compared to the left hand, and you're not really sure, okay, who has jurisdiction over this? That was probably one of the legal issues there. It says Congress did not repeal the Refuge Act. The law is still used by the Corps of Engineers to prevent obstructions to navigation. In some pollution enforcement cases, the federal government has used it as a supplemental authority along with the FWPCA. Okay, so here's the good news with this, because I'm sure there's some listening to this thinking, okay, so more rules, laws, and regulations. Why do we want this? Here's the thing. There are times that you do need more rules, laws, and regulations, and there are times they just need to be amended. So if you'll notice that environmentalism in the United States technically goes back a long ways, but in terms of being on the books, in terms of federally enforced, this goes back to 1899. But that doesn't mean that they were not trying to handle these issues before then. Okay, because remember, you've got the Industrial Revolution, we're coming out of the Civil War, I think the Civil War was in 1860s. So there's a lot of things that change over time, right? And our industries change as well. So if you remember, back in the late 1800s, the North was considered industrial. The South was considered more farming. So you have these two different types of industry, within the United States to begin with, and then they're both growing and at different rates. So they're trying to figure out, okay, how do we get our industries to grow? And then how do we properly dump up this stuff? Because this is new to us. So, but also, how can we still make our cities and towns in the country beautiful without ruining it? Because do we need these products? Yes. Do we need jobs? Yes. Do we need industrialization? Yes, of course we do. But we need to keep things good and clean. So it's baby steps. It's baby steps towards the future. So, needless to say, a little bit later in this podcast, we're going to go over all the different federal agencies that there are, go into more detail with them, and then look at which ones are still around and which ones were created, but then they either merged with another federal agency or they are no longer around because they are no longer needed. Sometimes federal agencies merge with each other, and other times one kind of takes over the other in hopefully a good way. Hopefully it's not like a corporate merger, where it's not always pleasant, but the whole point is that we're not supposed to have duplication. So what was happening before the EPA was created, there was duplication of jobs and job responsibilities in terms of trying to get a handle on the pollution in the environment. So it's a good thing that President Richard Nixon created the EPA, signed that into law, and actually made it so that the EPA is the hub. Anything to do with the environment anything that has to deal with those federal agencies goes directly through the EPA. Because otherwise, you've got multiple people trying to take charge of something, and then, what is the private sector supposed to do? And what is the regular everyday citizen, what are they supposed to do when they have multiple government agencies, multiple federal agencies barking at them, saying, hey, you owe us, or you're supposed to report to us, or we're going to fine you. And it's like, okay, well, who am I supposed to report to? Because there's multiple people telling me either the same thing or different things, but you're both complaining about the environment. That's one reason why the EPA was created, so that there would be consistency, so the right hand would know what the left hand is doing. Because if you don't really know where you're going, then you're not going to know when you have arrived, much less you're not going to know when you are in fact lost. So that's why this is so important. So again, the EPA, technically it has its beginnings going all the way back to 1899, because that's one of the original federal acts or laws on the books about the environment. But people were already trying to help the environment even before 1899, because see, here's the thing. Rules, laws, and regulations don't just fall out of the sky. They're very intentional. They're very serious. And so I bet what happened was, because this is typically what happens, people notice things. And they're like, hey, wait a second. Is that supposed to be in the river? Are we supposed to be dumping that in the ocean? Are we supposed to be this close to a riverbank? These kinds of things. People are noticing that, hey, we need to take better care of the environment. We need to care about our country. So I guarantee you, I bet these issues were going on for probably 2 or 3 decades before 1899 and before this was ever passed. Because here's the thing. Normally, and I say normally the way that rules, laws, and regulations are passed is because they notice a problem, they notice an issue. And so they want to correct it and make things better. So it's kind of like the after effect. There's an issue, okay, so let's prevent this from happening in the future. Let's try and, cushion the blow of this. So it's not retroactive, it's just cause and effect. So the cause is pollution. The effect is, okay, peoples back in the 1890s, if not earlier, were noticing there's an issue and we need to protect our waterways. So that's why they passed something like this. It wasn't just, let's just pass a random law or a random act. It's not the same as with Obamacare. Obamacare to me was very much random. And they wanted to take over our health care. They want to take over health insurance companies and put health insurance companies out of business. So I'm not a big fan of Obamacare because when Obamacare passed, it greatly affected the state of Oklahoma. It was horrible. Our insurance premiums went up. They skyrocketed. The cost of medicine skyrocketed. Everything medical, everything health insurance, everything pharmaceutical, anything in the healthcare industry, drastically, the prices were hiked. It was no longer affordable. They call it the Affordable Care Act. My goodness, it's the Unaffordable Care Act is what it is. And they didn't really take into consideration who this affects. See, here's the thing. In regards to the Rivers and Harbors Act of 1899, it was about safety. It wasn't about putting people out of business. And it wasn't about raising the price of something. And it wasn't punishing people. It was about safety. And it wasn't about taking over a whole industry. Obamacare, it tried to take over all these different health insurance companies. And there are some health insurance companies that are no longer around because of that stupid law. But with the Rivers and Harbors Act, its goal was just to protect people. It did not try and put, shipyards out of business. It did not try and put anybody in the transportation business. It did not try and put them out of business. That was not the goal. It was just safety. That's it. And it didn't demonize companies that made a mistake. It just said, hey, you have to purchase a permit to do that. Otherwise, you have to pay a fine. See, when we focus on the simple, then we are better able to handle the complex. But if all we're looking at is the impossible and we're just focusing on things that are too complex, like we're biting off more than we can chew, that's where the problem happens. Because if you bite off more than you can chew, you can't really handle much of anything. But if you handle it from a baby steps point of view, and you handle it that way, you will do way more good. And you will be able to see more of the fruit of your labor come to pass. You will see it come to fruition, which is what I think everybody wants. Because I think there's nothing more disappointing when you work really hard, but then you never see the outcome of it, or the outcome is not what you wanted. You know what I mean? So it's better to take continuous baby steps and work on as you go along, as opposed to just biting off a big old chunk of something and then expecting to be able to chew it and swallow it. And I'm just, that's not how you handle things appropriately. So in this case, they handled it very appropriately. They saw there was a problem. And so they just said, okay, well, let's just make it so you have to have a permit. It's something that simple. They didn't put people out of business. They didn't demonize anyone. They just said you have to have a permit, because they know people need to use the waterways, and they knew that people needed to be able to dump things, but they needed to dump it in the appropriate place. That's all. It was just about safety. And that's what I like about this act, is that it focuses on something simple that is relevant to everybody. And it's not about politics. It's not about ideologies. It's simply about public safety, which applies to everybody, regardless of whether you are a citizen or not. It doesn't matter what race you are. It doesn't matter your income status. It doesn't matter what sex you are, what gender, what occupation you have, or your age, whatever the case may be, because safety applies to everybody equally, man, woman, or child. It applies to everybody equally. And it also applies to our environment. To the wildlife, animal life, plant life. I mean, it applies to everything, because the environment belongs to us, because we are part of the environment. So I think this is a great testament to the fact that people did care about the environment even back then, but they were not crazy liberal nutbags about it. They didn't storm the Capitol over it. They didn't manipulate votes. They didn't manipulate elections. They didn't manipulate government officials. They just simply said, hey, if you want to do this, you have to have a permit. That's all. Just simple, short and sweet. It's like going to get a driver's license. It's like you want to operate a vehicle? Okay, you have to have a license to do that. But the really good thing about the permits for the Rivers and Harbors Act is that it has to be approved by Congress. So, and that's especially in regards to when you are trying to dam rivers or streams. So, I think that's really smart to do that, because sometimes people have this horrible opinion of Congress, like they're stupid and don't care. I mean, there may be some morons that are serving terms in Congress, but I think the majority of them are smart, knowledgeable, have common sense, regardless of what side of the aisle they're on. I do think that both sides of the aisle really care. I think they do care about people. I do think they care about the environment. And I'm always impressed and happy and very glad whenever they find common ground, because I think something like this, you can easily find common ground. Because you want the common good. But you're not, how do I describe this? You want the common good, but that doesn't mean you're a socialist or a fascist or a communist. That doesn't mean that you think everybody should live in a commune. It just means that, you want everybody to be safe. But you don't have to confiscate other people's property just to ensure safety. Which is, in fact, what the EPA has been doing. And they've been doing that for a long time, unfortunately, but it really ramped up during Obama's term. He allowed the EPA to do a lot of things that was just really bad, and there were a whole lot of court cases. I mean, good luck trying to fight the EPA sometimes if you're just a regular mom and pop kind of person, and you don't have a printing press like the government does in terms of currency. So, unfortunately, sometimes the EPA, it thinks that it has permission to protect the common good by confiscating from the common good, which is you and me. Well, that's not right. It's not right at all. In fact, that's legalized thievery whenever the EPA or the federal government confiscates your property. If they take your property or confiscate it, they need to pay you for it. And you need to be in the position, and you do have the position of giving them permission to do that. They can't just take it. They have to buy your property from you. They can't just take it. And they have to give you what your property costs. They can't lowball you. I know that sometimes they get away with it, and that's wrong. But they're not supposed to do that. That's not right. Unfortunately, sometimes our federal government doesn't like to pay its bills. And it thinks that it shouldn't have to pay retail price, or it shouldn't have to pay what things are actually worth. An example of that is in Medicare and Medicaid, particularly in Medicare. When you're on Medicare, you are forced, first of all, you're forced onto Medicare once you reach a certain age, and you're forced onto generics. Not all generics are great. In fact, some of them are quite bad. There's a reason why the brand name is so good. It's because it's more than likely made in the United States or in Europe. You know what's in it, and it just works better than generics. As mentioned previously, a lot of generics are made in other countries that they don't have a Food Drug Administration. They don't have an FDA. They don't have the same safety standards that we have. And it's really caused a lot of harm to a lot of people's health. So just because there's a generic, I would go with the brand name first. Because brand name drugs tend to be made a whole lot better than generic. And plus generics, they can claim that they have the same efficacy. They don't always have that. Sometimes it's only a maximum of like 85% of being effective. And plus, you may not exactly know what's in your generic drug, especially if it's made in India or China or Croatia or one of these other countries that they don't really care or value human life the same way that we do, and they don't have the same rules, laws, and regulations that we have. See, because here's the thing, these other countries, they don't value safety the way the United States does. And you don't have to be a crazy liberal nutbag to care about safety. Safety is basic. It doesn't matter what party you're in. When you go to bed at night, you like to think and believe that you're safe, right? By locking your front and back door. That safety is basic. It's not political. It's not an agenda. It's just basic. Like when you're driving a car, you want to know that it's safe to drive it, right? Airbags, anti-lock brakes, all this good stuff. You want to know that it's safe. You don't have to be a Republican to want safety. You don't have to be a Democrat to expect an airbag to work. I mean, it's just basic. It's basic instinct to want to feel safe and to desire that. So I think the more that we stop politicizing things that are human nature, meaning like you want to be safe, and stop making that an agenda issue and just let it be what it is, where safety applies to everybody equally. I think if we just keep it simple, then we can pass more rules, laws, and regulations that are actually beneficial to people and not a hindrance, or we can repeal the ones that are bad. Because there are a great many rules, laws, and regulations I don't agree with, and I think they need to be repealed, and we can discuss that in another podcast. Because, if you are just a nation of laws, then you obviously don't trust your people to do the right thing, and you think they don't have a brain. But if you are a nation of liberty and freedom, then people are free to be themselves, and they are free to do what's right because they choose to do what's right. Not because the government strong arms them, but because they just want to do what's right, because that's typically what mankind wants to do. It's actually very rare for people to be evil. People can be stupid, but that's not evil. Unfortunately, whenever you put the government in charge of every little thing, it demonizes what it means to be a human being. And it's like, well, if you're going to demonize what it means to be a human being, then technically we're all in the wrong all the time, but yet we're not. But if you put your government in charge of all these different things like this, when you have socialism, communism, or fascism, you're basically never going to know which end is up. which is very unfortunate because it leads to uncertainty. See, when you have liberty and freedom, you always know which way is up. Because you're free to choose to have a good life. And your rules, laws, and regulations are not a burden. See, like this Rivers and Harbors Act of 1899 and the Refuge Act, I don't think it's a burden at all. I don't see anything wrong with it. And believe me, if I thought something was wrong with it, I would say it. I'd be like, listen up, listeners, I found one that's bad. Don't like it. You know I would tell you straight up. But this one, I'm impressed with it. It's short, sweet, to the point, it's simple, and it actually created a great foundation for people in the future, like within 100 years later, if not less. It created a baseline of how to navigate things that we don't like what's going on in the environment and how to make things better. Not demonizing, not shaming, not blaming, just focusing on what we can do. What do we have control over? I've often found that whenever people are anxious or worried, it's because they feel like they don't have control. And there are some things that they don't have control over, and that makes them very nervous. But I encourage people, focus on what you can control. Because literally, that's all you can control. But that's a good thing. Because then if you focus on what you can control and what you can do, then you don't have the weight of the world on your shoulders. Because not a single one of us is supposed to have the weight of the world on us. I mean, you talk about being cruel to yourself. Like, don't take on more than you can handle or take on more than what you can do. It's like when I started this podcast, I thought, okay, I want to start a podcast, but I want to do something that I really care about, because I looked up all these podcasts and whatnot, and I was like, I know there's a lot of podcasts that are silly, they're funny, some are super serious, like way more serious than mine. But I know that there's a lot of podcasts out there that's kind of not necessarily folly, but they're just kind of silly. And I'm not naturally a silly person. I mean, I like to laugh. Like, one of my favorite movies is Super Troopers. I love that movie. I truly love it. Like, whenever I was in college, and if ever I was having a rough week, I would watch Super Troopers almost every single Friday night. And it would just crack me up, and it would just lighten the mood. I mean, sometimes I would invite friends over. I was like, okay, you having a stressful week? Yes, we hate it. Let's watch Super Troopers. Like, oh, thank God. It's just like, yes, we've seen it a million times, but it's so funny. So here's the thing. Not a single one of us is made to take on the burdens of this world. Like, that's not our job. We can only control what we can control, but I tell you what, when you tackle what you can control in what you know to be true, it gives you more confidence to handle things in your life, and also you start to enjoy your life more, because it's one of those things, like, once you get going, you kind of develop a good pace, a good steady pace in accomplishing things. And I think that's really important for us. Because, let me put it this way. When I was looking at what to discuss on my podcast, it was a little overwhelming in the beginning. Like, before I started, I was like, well, do I want to do what other people are doing and just crack jokes, or, be funny, or just do lighthearted stuff? And I did try another podcast at the same time as this one. It's called The Good News or something, or it didn't last long at all, and I discontinued it. I was like, that's not who I naturally am. I mean, I can be funny, that's great, but I'm kind of more conservative and slightly on the serious side. Not super serious, I can't ever have fun, but I just thought, I think we have enough comedians out there, and if God wants me to be a comedian, then He can have me host the Oscars sometime. I wouldn't mind doing that, or the Emmys, or whatever the case may be. I could definitely host it, but here's the thing, like, I just got to thinking about it. It's like, well, I can either do what other people are doing, or I can do what I want to do. I need to do what my calling is. And I've always been concerned about workers' rights. Always. Ever since I was like 14 or 15 or 16 years old when I entered the workforce. I mean, I legally started working when I was 16, but I was already volunteering and helping people out, as a teenager, as a teeny bopper. And I'm not saying that that was illegal labor. I'm not saying that at all. But I'm just saying that, I took it very seriously when I got a job for the first time when I was 16. And I wanted to make sure that I knew my social security number, that I knew what tax forms I was filling out, even as a teeny bopper. I mean, I really researched stuff. And this was way back in the day when stuff was not always readily available online. And it was kind of unheard of to ask serious questions as a really young person, as a teenager. Like adults would just look at me and be like, why are you asking this? And it's like, because we're dealing with my labor and we're dealing with my wages. We're dealing with my taxes. I just kind of want to know the facts. So that's just always been my mindset. And I thought, what do I want to focus on? Like, what means a lot to me? And, the thing that means a lot to me is workers' rights. Making sure that people are protected. And another reason why I believe in workers' rights and being knowledgeable about different things, even if it goes back to 1899, I think that's wonderful. I think the further back you go in time and research these things, the more you realize how important your rights are even today. And you realize all the good work that people did in times past to help you, even though they never knew you. The work that they did technically set the foundation for you and your life, which is great, right? But another reason why I started this podcast was because Oklahoma is an at-will state. And there are a lot of things that I do not agree with. Does that mean I want socialism, communism, or fascism? No. Because it would be way worse. Way worse. I don't want that because I know what those are like. I've researched those enough. I've met people from countries like that have those issues. And you know what? There's a reason why they left their country and came to the United States. I mean, that's just how it is. It's like, why would you want to become like something that people are leaving? But I do think it is important to do good wherever you are. So even though I'm not always happy with the things that happen in Oklahoma, I know that I can do good wherever I am, wherever God puts me. Because I will always stand up for the worker. I will always stand up for workers' rights. Because technically every single one of us is a worker. Whether you have a job or not, you are a worker. You just may not realize it. Just because you retire, that doesn't mean you no longer have workers' rights. That doesn't mean they're null and void and don't apply to you anymore. They still apply to you. Especially in tax and labor laws. So it's very important to realize that you have value. You have value far more than you realize. So being that we know that to be true, I think it's important that we know the history of our country and we know the history of these rules, laws, and regulations that directly impact or affect our everyday life in ways that we may not realize until like a catastrophe happens, like a tornado or a hurricane or, like for example, COVID-19 or something. It's very interesting, like all the workers' rights issues that occurred during and after the pandemic. Like one of the things I do not agree with is I don't think it's appropriate for an employer to require you to get the vaccine. I don't agree with that. Do I think everybody should get the vaccine? Yes. I think that if you can medically get the vaccine, meaning you're not allergic to the ingredients or you're not on a medication that would interact with that, and you have permission from your doctor and that's considered safe enough for you to take, which for the majority of the population, it is a very safe vaccine. I do think the majority of the population should get that vaccine, but I don't think your labor, your job, should be dependent upon whether or not you get vaccinated. See, because here's the thing, more people have died of the flu than of COVID-19. But do we force people to get the flu vaccine? No. And here's the thing, I couldn't stand working with people that did not get the flu vaccine because almost every year they got the flu. And they would spread it like crazy at work because they would not stay home when they were sick. That angered me. That made me so mad. I'm like, I don't like that. Because what sucks is that a lot of times when people get the flu, they also get bronchitis or pneumonia, so then they're just a walking petri dish of disease. I hate that crap. Believe me. But it's one of those things that even though I don't like that stupidity, because it is stupid to walk around sick and not care that you're infecting people. I think that's stupid. I think it's evil. Here's the thing though. You're not required to get the flu vaccine. I think people should be. If they're going to require that you get COVID-19 vaccine, I think you should be required to get every shot that there is, which would be the flu, COVID-19, HPV, hepatitis A, hepatitis B, measles, mumps, rubella. There are a whole bunch of others. I wish the shingles vaccine was available to everybody, but stupidly our government and what's it called, the American Medical Association, they're so dumb these days. They're morons. Like they've become socialists. They limit healthcare like you would not believe. Like back in the day, it used to mean something really good when the American Medical Association would give its approval of something. Like it used to have warrant to it. Like it used to mean something. It doesn't anymore. The American Medical Association is predominantly in the back pocket of the federal government, so it very much promotes limited healthcare. And it's like, how can you be a medical association and be limiting healthcare in any way, shape, or form? Like, that just tells me right there they don't value human life anymore. They don't care if it gets destroyed or limited. So, I mean, you kind of have to, how to describe this? You have to be careful what you put your faith in. I learned that lesson. Like a lot of these medical associations, they don't care about people like you think they do. A lot of them are just money-making machines. But they get to process their taxes as nonprofits because they claim to care about people and they claim to not be for profit. I'm like, really? So would you work for free if you were on that board? Would you decline being flown around on a fancy jet if you were on that medical board? You know what I mean? Like, they need to put their money where their mouth is. So, I mean, back in the day, these associations, they used to mean something, and they do a lot of good. They did do a lot of good. It's just now they're kind of being run in a very laissez-faire, socialist kind of way. And it always concerns me whenever a medical association sides with the federal government on anything, because they used to never do that. Because the only reason why we have such good modern medicine and good medical inventions here in the United States is because it's not run by the government. If you want insurance or healthcare that's run by the government, go to the USSR. Go to a communist country where it sucks being over there. Your healthcare is limited and disease spreads very quickly over there. It's just how it is. But that's the issue that can happen whenever you put the federal government in charge of something like that, and when it gets off course. In the case of this Rivers and Harbors Act, it's not off course. It's right on target, and I think it did a really good job. And if anything, it makes me really glad that I started this podcast, because not only do I get to share this information with other people, but I get to learn something about it. I get to learn about my country, which is wonderful. I love that. Because one of my favorite topics in schools was civic studies. Because we got to learn what it meant to be an American. And it wasn't political. It wasn't criterion race theory. It wasn't demonizing anything. It was just telling you the facts about your country, when it was founded, who these people were, who the current administration is, and things of that nature. It was just give me the facts. Like, I don't need a Lifetime Movie Network Debbie Downer story about it. I just need to know the facts. That's it. This is really good about this, is that we get to focus on the facts, and we can each draw our own conclusions, which is wonderful, because we have that freedom here in the United States. In other countries, you're not hardly allowed to speak up about anything. Anything. And the curriculum is very much controlled. Like, ridiculously controlled. And whenever you have the government in charge of your curriculum, there's always an agenda behind that. Always. Because you're going to have lack of freedom of speech. And there's going to be favoritism, but it's going to be how do I describe this? Political favoritism. Which means that you and I, the citizens, will always suffer, because I guarantee you, the federal government does not view citizens as their favorite. The federal government, or any kind of government, views itself as its favorite. And it just uses the citizens for tax dollars. Should we pay our taxes? Yes, it's important. That's wonderful. Taxes are very important. We should all pay them. But it should be a reasonable amount. I've said this in times past. I don't think the taxes should be above 10%, because I think if a government needs more than 10% of everybody's wages, it's got a big spending problem. and they need to balance their books. I mean, I think we have trillions of dollars in debt right now. I mean, and you can't blame that all on Republican presidents that went to war. Because Republican presidents are not the only one that have taken the United States to war. There have been Democrats and Republicans. But what I've noticed is that Democrats, they don't like to balance their books. And it's like, well, how, if a company doesn't balance its books, how do you expect that company to pass an audit? And how do you expect them to stay in business? Like, just keep it simple. Like, balance your books. If you can't afford something, just admit you can't afford something. There's nothing wrong with that. And then once you can afford something, then you spend the money on it. That's just common sense. And again, that's just baby steps towards a brighter and better future, but you at least have to acknowledge what's going on, right? I mean, that's just common sense. I just wish our government had more common sense, but I think that kind of comes and goes depending on who is in charge of things, of these different federal agencies. And I don't just mean the President of the United States, because the President is not in charge of every federal agency. It's not a dictatorship. We have a democracy, so that's one of the great things about the United States. I mean, we have a lot of things to be grateful for and to be appreciative for in the United States, but one of the things I'm really grateful for is that, whoever is serving as president, doesn't matter if it's Democrat or Republican. Of course, right now it's President Biden. But, what I love about the United States is that the president does not put himself in charge of every federal agency. First of all, can you imagine how exhausting that job would be? And number two, it would not be appropriate to be in charge of every federal agency, because that's a dictatorship. That's what Putin does. That's what Stalin did. That's what Hitler did. That's what Mussolini did. I mean, are any of those names positive names? No. See, one of the good things about the United States, among other things, is that we know that we can trust other people, even though we still need to practice some due diligence. It's just that, we behave in a way better fashion than other countries, especially within our government agencies. Like, even though I don't agree with everything that the EPA does, it's still way better run than some of the crazy environmentalists in like the UK and in France. Like France, I feel so sorry for their citizens. I feel so sorry for their citizens. Let me get a drink of water. Their citizens over there in France have been having to deal with a tyrannical government for probably well over 8 years now. I mean, they're trying to force the French citizens to have, they're trying to force people into having government daycare. And even if you are a stay-at-home mom, you are not allowed to have your child at home with you. You are forced to take it to a daycare via the government. And that's what Biden's administration has been trying to get passed here in the United States. I mean, they have a way of worming around it and trying to make it seem like it's a good thing. They try and make it seem like, oh, well, women want to go back to work and daycare should be paid for by the employer and or the federal government. Well, see, here's the thing. I don't think daycare should be paid by the employer. That's not a right. That's not a health benefit. That's the responsibility of the parents. I mean, that's just how it is. Daycare is a service that you purchase. It's not a right. It's not in the Constitution. It's not in the U.S. Constitution, and it is not in your state's Constitution. See, because here's the thing. If you want the federal government to be in charge of that and to enforce that, you're basically putting the federal government in charge of your children, which is what China has done. And China bumps off children. So just because the federal government or any government says they care about your kids, you can't always believe that. The proof is in the pudding, as they say. Do I think daycare should be available for people if they need it? Sure, but it's not the responsibility of the employer to pay for that. I think that's a nice perk if they provide it, if they can afford it, but to demand it and to require it? No, sorry, that's wrong. That's wrong. the employer is not responsible for other people's children. Because all they're doing is employing the adults. Or they're just employing the parents or whatever the case may be. The children don't work there. And that may offend some people, but here's the thing. Whatever you try and get someone else to pay for you, and you're trying to force them to pay for it, is whatever right or liberty you are sacrificing. Instead of trying to get someone else to pay for your daycare, why don't you start asking God to bless you and make you a millionaire or a billionaire so then you can not only afford whatever daycare you want, but you can buy a yacht and have a nanny for your child. Think about that. Do you want to live a mediocre life and be demanding and complaining, or do you want to live a great life and do whatever you want? Of course, within reason, you know what I mean? As long as it's legal and moral, but I'm saying that you need to think in terms of wealth and prosperity, not in terms of shaming and blaming. See, because, for example, with the Rivers and Harbors Act of 1899, it has nothing to do with shaming and blaming. It was about safety, and also it wanted to make sure that industries could still grow. They just need a permit. But if you have the mentality that the government should pay for this or my employer should pay for this, all you're trying to do is get someone else to pay for what you want, and that's a form of greed. Greed is not moral, and it's technically not legal. It's like what I've said in the past in other podcasts where I said greed is not just in Wall Street. In fact, that's the last place you should look. Greed occurs in so many other places, and it's mostly hidden. And it's those hidden places where we need to be looking. Because if you think about Wall Street, it's heavily regulated and it's overregulated. That's why we need to be paying attention to all the places where it's not regulated. Because that's where a lot of greed takes place, but it flies right under the radar. So just be aware of that and just, practice some due diligence in your life. I do the exact same thing. And believe me, there are a lot of things that I could complain about, that I easily could get angry about. But I made a decision a long time ago to not live that way. I would rather just be informative about stuff and not be angry or irritated, even though there are some things that ruffle my feathers every now and then. It doesn't serve any good to just be offended all the time. Focus on what you can control. Focus on doing good. And I love this phrase, trust God, do good. I love that because it's short, sweet, to the point, and that comes from Joyce Meyer. I did not think of that, she did. Trust God, do good. She has excellent advice for people of all ages. And if anybody knows what they're talking about, it is Joyce Meyer, because she had a very tough upbringing for sure. But she has a very positive, very say it like it is kind of message, and I love that because she's not into fluff. I don't do fluff. I would think that if anyone has listened to this podcast long enough, you realize I'm not a fluff kind of gal. I was in a sorority for a year and a half, and that's all I could take. When I was in my 20s, I was like, this is not what I thought it was going to be at all. I kind of had a feeling I wouldn't enjoy it, but I was like, well, I'll try it. My sister's in a sorority. I'll give it a whirl with a twirl, and you know what? It just it's not me. And that's okay. So I realized that, I need to be who God wants me to be. I need to stop following the trends or thinking that I need to follow the trends, which is why I chose to do this podcast the way that I chose, which is the endurance of labor laws. It's to focus on what I really care about. Because, see, here's the thing. And I'll close with this because we're going a little over an hour here, but the Rivers and Harbors Act of 1899, this affects labor. But it also protects labor. See, because whenever you protect the environment, you are also protecting people because we live in the environment. That's why it's better to focus on the simple and to keep it simple. Focus on the simple things that you can't control. Like, don't make it political. Don't make it a ideology. Because when you keep it simple, it applies to everybody, and everybody gets it and they understand it. It's better to keep it simple so that regardless of what generation is going back in time and reading this stuff, they understand it. And they understand the beginnings of X, Y, Z, of whatever we're talking about. In this case, we're talking about the environment, but also it's also helpful in terms of labor laws. Because if you keep the environment safe, then your workplace will naturally be safe. But if all you do is shame and blame employers, you're missing the mark. And you're actually jeopardizing your job and your salaries by shaming and blaming your employer. Like, focus on what you want to change, not what you want to blame, and not what you want to try and legally steal from somebody. Or even illegally. Because, thievery is thievery. I don't care if it's legal or illegal. It's thievery, and I don't approve of it. Focus on the things that you want to do good and that you want to see changed. But if you find that on your list, the majority of things you want to change are just people, I got news for you. You're looking at things completely wrong. You're not going to change people. And you have no right to do that. Just like I have no right to do that. Like, I know that there are people all over the world listening to my podcast, and I have my own opinions and I have my own way of looking at things, but I have no right to force someone to change. I can't force anyone to change, but I have no right to be like, you should think the way I do. I have no right to think that way. I have no right to make that demand whatsoever. I expect people to be able to think for themselves and to do what God has called them to do in their life. Because their journey is not my journey, and vice versa. I'm not in charge of other people's lives. If someone is age 18 or older, I expect them to act like an adult, and I expect them to get it together and get out there and work. I expect them to enjoy their life. Regardless of what occurs, enjoy your life. Because it's your life. It's not mine. It belongs to you. Can we share ideas? Sure, by all means. Can we have differences of opinion? For sure. That's great, because it's usually in the differences of opinion where we can always find common ground, and we realize we're really not that different. And we might even realize that we actually care about the same things. That's what I've learned with doing this podcast. I kind of suspected it was going to go that way, that I was going to find that there's more people out there that care about the same things, just like me. But sometimes it's one of those things you need to kind of see it to believe it, even though you suspect it. But it's so nice to see if there's other people that actually care about labor laws and they care about the worker, but they're not like psychotic about it. They're not like just pro-union all the time. And unions have their place, but sometimes unions don't know their place. And they don't stay in line with what they say they're going to do to help protect the worker. They're just about trying to take over a company. Well, if that's not a reverse monopoly, I don't know what is. So I think we just need to really have in mind and in our heart, we need to want what's best for the other individual. We need to want what's best for each other. Even if I disagree with someone. Like, I don't agree with passing a lot of rules, laws, and regulations, but I do know that some of them are very important and that we need them. Others, we need to get rid of immediately. Like Obamacare. My health care was perfectly fine before Obamacare was passed. It went to crap. It went in the toilet when Obamacare was passed. It was horrible. I mean, it was devastating what all that law did to our healthcare system. And it's just like, you have got to be kidding me. The last thing I want to be like is like the United Kingdom or Great Britain or whatever, or be like Australia. with their socialized medicine. That's not right. I don't ever want to be put on a waiting list. Ever. It's like, when you need help with something, you need it right away, right? Why make someone wait? Well, that's what the government does. And what we're learning with these Superfund sites, and I'll close with this, some of these Superfund sites, they were put on the list back in the 80s, but they're still not cleaned up. And we've got like almost 1,400 of them, just on the national priorities list, okay? We still have 40,000 littered across the United States that have still not been cleaned up. Can we get it done? For sure. But I think this shows just how slow the federal government is to get things done. Even though I know they're trying in some ways, and in other ways, they're not trying at all, or they're not doing good enough. And they should be held accountable to the taxpayer, because we're the ones that are paying billions of dollars for these agencies within the EPA to clean up this stuff. I mean, some things can be cleaned up a lot quicker than others. And I get that some of the Superfund sites that we've gone over, some of them are really bad. But also, we've had new technology and new inventions that have come out since the 80s. And we have a lot of talented people in this country that want to help. That's why I've always been of the opinion that yes, we have these Superfund sites in the United States, but that's a wonderful opportunity to do good. We can clean it up. And we can do it in our lifetime. I don't think we should look at it as, oh, isn't this horrible? It's going to take forever. Do you really want to work with someone that's a Debbie Downer and just sees the bad in everything? No, I can't stand working with people like that. It's just, they make it so difficult to accomplish anything. And then when it's difficult to accomplish something, they go, see, I was right. It's like, no, actually, you were wrong. You were the sour apple in the barrel, and you caused this project to cost more than it should have, and you slowed it down, and you jeopardized the outcome of it by your negativity and by you not wanting to work. How many people have you met that have been like that? I've met plenty, and I've worked with plenty of them. They're horrible. And the thing, what they don't realize is that those kinds of people the reason why they're a problem is because they have a horrible work ethic. If someone has a horrible work ethic, you need to fire them. Moving them to another department doesn't work because you know what? They will ruin every department that they get transferred to. I have learned that over the years. Sometimes we get soft as a people. And we think, well, I don't want someone to lose their job. Maybe they just don't like this department. No, guess what? They probably just don't like working. They're lazy. They're good at complaining. They're good at whining. But do they get it done? Do they get the job done? No. They're saboteurs. They're Debbie Downers. They're dream killers. I mean, why waste your time, your energy, your breath? I mean, me personally, I just say I don't waste my brain space on people like that. Because the risk is too great. When you're around people like that and you hire people like that and you keep them on your staff, you're jeopardizing the future of your project and your company. Because it's Debbie Downers and dream killers that will never have your back. They're actually very selfish, greedy, jealous people. Nobody likes to say that, but it's the truth. And if you disagree with me and you want to try and prove me wrong, write me a message. Email me if you want. Reach out to me, by all means, and be like, Lesley, you are wrong and I have proof. I'll be like, okay, let's hear it. I'll even have you on my show. But I tell you what, I can already tell you, you're wrong. I say that respectfully. See, because here's the thing. Whatever bad behavior you defend is what you tolerate. And whatever you tolerate is what you allow to contaminate. Protecting a bad worker and not firing them is like not leaving a spouse that cheats on you all the time and keeps giving you a sexually transmitted disease. You know, like gonorrhea, chlamydia, trichomonas, or whatever that other one is called. They have a behavior problem. They don't care about you. And I know that is an extreme example, but, you know, let's use a different one. Let's say if you keep an employee and you don't fire them, and they're a bad employee, they're a Debbie Downer, and they sabotage projects with their negative behavior and their negative actions, keeping them, let's see, it's like staying in an abusive relationship. It's never going to work out. Here's the thing. You can't change people. People have to change themselves. And sometimes it takes a firing to get someone to realize, I was the problem. Sometimes people don't change until they are brought to their knees and they ask God for help. That doesn't mean get religious or spiritual on people. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that sometimes people don't change until they've lost everything. And I'm not saying force someone into poverty. I'm not saying that at all. I'm just saying that sometimes people don't change until they hit rock bottom. But if you don't do what's right for you and your company and your department, then your department and your company will hit rock bottom. And that person that brought you there to your knees will not be there to help lift you up. They're still going to be negative, and they're going to say things like, we knew it wouldn't work out. I guess this just proved me right. Do you really want to listen to that crap, that garbage? No, don't do that. Please don't pull the inclusive card and say, we're inclusive. Hey, guess what? You don't have to include bad people in your workplace. You don't. And that may be a little off topic from what we're talking about, but something told me to say that. I don't know how to describe it. Something is telling me that someone needed to hear that today. If you've got someone working for you that bothers you, that doesn't have your back, doesn't care about your company, doesn't really have the best work ethic, you need to let them go. They can file unemployment all day and all night. Who cares? Get somebody else in their place. Hire somebody that's way more talented than them. Hire someone that's way more positive than them. Don't waste your time, your energy, your breath, your brain space, on people that only care about themselves. Selfish people tend to be very negative, heartless people. Because they make it all about them. But you know what's interesting is that whenever they make it all about themselves, they never make their bad behavior about themselves. They blame everybody else except themselves about their behavior problem. That's a narcissist. That's a very selfish, narcissist person. And guess what? You will never win an argument with them. Never. And why bother? You know they're wrong, so just walk away and be like, sorry, you're out of here. Go to HR. This obviously isn't the place for you. And it's okay to let people go. It's okay to do that. Please do not be fearful of the repercussions, if any, of firing someone, of letting them go. And I'm saying that from an at-will state. And I don't like to give advice on how to fire someone, but believe me, I've worked with some people that I'm like, why does this employer keep this person here? Why are they putting up with this crap? It's destroying their business. It's really sad. I mean, keeping a bad employee is like baking cookies, and let's say you have baking soda or baking powder that's outdated, it's expired. But you keep using it, and guess what? That bad ingredient, because it's bad, it's spoiled, it's no good, it keeps ruining your cookies. And then you wonder why your cookies don't taste good or they don't look right. It's because you haven't replaced the bad ingredient with a good ingredient. But yet you're still trying to get the same results. You think you're going to get really good cookies with outdated ingredients, and guess what? You're not. So I guess, look at things from a chef's point of view or from a baker's point of view, because I'm a baker. I bake pies and cookies and things, but predominantly I specialize in pies. But you need to know when to walk away from stuff and when to seek something better. And I think that's what was going on here with the Rivers and Harbors Act of 1899. They wanted something better. They knew they needed to change. And so that's why they passed this act. But they did it in a non-confrontational way. They did it based on safety. They did not do it based on who was in office. They did not pass it based on who's serving in Congress or Senate or President. They did not do it based on, okay, which company do we, can we not stand, and who do we want to get rid of in terms of companies and want to take all their money. They didn't pass that act based on those things. They only passed it based on safety. That's it. Keep it simple, trust God, and do good. I'll go ahead and let you guys go, but until next time, I pray that you're happy, healthy, and whole, that you have a wonderful day and a wonderful week. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.